Jum, jum, jum. Hi, hi, hey, hey. Returning home after torrential rain, roads trampled and damp, anticipation of soft, warm sun. Forecasting. Quite a lot of ducks. A willow tree. Many small portals. Accumulated readings.
That's actually the first time we've shown that trailer. Thanks for making that, Anna. And that is like a sort of a snapshots in the chronology of the performance, which was 1 hour long. So I'm going to say some words about my artistic research in this work and also describe a little bit the form of it for people who didn't experience it. And then I'm going to invite my collaborator, Jamie Forth, to say a bit more about the elements that you were involved in with that. And then Robin is going to say something about some of the results of data analysis. And then we can talk about those things. So I've written this, and I didn't, no pun intended, to be reading in the work called, about the work called Readings of What Was Never Written, but so I think this helps me, get my thoughts in order. So in Readings of What Was Never Written, I'm joined by collaborating performers Temitope Ajose, Ben Ash, who is here, and Iris Ipo Chan, who is here, and Katie Ko, and also live sound designer Joel Cahen. Readings is a continuation of my ongoing investigation of choreographic liveness as an environment that affords the generation of particular forms of embodied knowledge or knowing. And it also brings this investigation into relationship with the interdisciplinary scientific context of NEUROLIVE through a layer of science fiction. It's a ritual-like and meditative performance that approaches the practice of dancing and the practice of witnessing dancing as embodied processes of taking a reading. And part of what makes this phrase, taking a reading, important to me is the way that it can invoke associations with both magic and science at the same time, with the kinds of readings that are taken by scientific measurement devices, and also more divinatory or magical readings, like the reading of palms, the reading of tarot cards or tea leaves. In my work, I'm interested in bringing attention to the perspective that embodied ways of knowing are an intrinsic part of live dance experiences, and that for performers and audience members alike, this can span a generative meshwork of our bodily capacities for knowing, including what I think of as more scientific ways of knowing, which I would describe as more rational, languaged, explicit ways of knowing, and what I think of as more magical ways of knowing, the more than rational, felt sense and intuitive ways of knowing. The science fiction layer of the work stages an AI that augments the embodied dimension of taking a reading. The AI is conceived as a system that reads multiple live data streams from the performers, the audience, and the room to generate spoken interpretations of the emergent dance, like an interpretive oracle. I initially proposed the AI interpreter as a science fiction that would seem like a live process of data interpretation was happening during the performance. But through the rather incredible expertise within the NEUROLIVE team, it actually became possible to, at least partly, make this science fiction a reality that had layers of AI actually operating during the performance. And so Jamie and I will talk a bit more about that together. Jamie Forth did the AI creation together with Mirko Febo. The title of the work, Readings of What Was Never Written, comes from Walter Benjamin, who wrote, "To read what was never written. Reading before all language occurs in the entrails, in the stars, or dances." These words come from Benjamin's On the Mimetic Faculty, but I encountered them quoted in Georges Didi Huberman's book, Atlas, or the Anxious Gay Science, which is a text that has informed a series of choreographic works of mine. Didi Huberman's book is about the art historian Aby Warburg and his famous Mnemosyne Atlas. It's from Warburg that I draw the phrase magic and science. And the importance of this phrase for me is its naming of magic and science as a single category, as a single ecology of interrelated and complementary ways of knowing, rather than two fundamentally separate and opposite things. I find this phrase really useful in naming what I think of as a choreographic orientation to ways of knowing or epistemology that underlies how I approach the practice of taking a reading, and actually also underlies my whole approach as artistic director in this interdisciplinary context. So the form that this work, Readings of What Was Never Written, takes is a roughly 1 hour long performance with the 5 of us dancing and Joel playing live music. Audience members are seated in 2 long single rows of chairs that face each other on either side of a dance floor that spans all the way from one wall to the other in the room. As audience members are coming into the performance space to find their seats, the performance is already in progress. We call this preliminary part of the performance the AI tuning phase. And it introduces the science fiction layer of the work. We work in 2 simultaneous groups. In each group, one person moves, while the other 1 or 2 sit and witness. The mover is in the practice of taking a reading, and occasionally speaks a word or phrase as an emergent way of languaging the felt sense experience of the reading that they are taking in that moment. The other performer, sitting, then repeats into a microphone the words that were just spoken by the moving performer, feeding that information into the AI system that is also following the movement through motion capture cameras. The AI system absorbs the combined information of the words and the movement and repeats the words back into the room in acknowledgement. And through this ongoing practice of tuning the AI each time the work is performed, the fiction proposes that the AI system is gradually learning a language and a practice of generating verbal interpretations from the dancing. After the entire audience has arrived and has been seated for a few minutes, the AI voice announces that the tuning sequence is complete and the practice stops. Before the performance continues, there's a 3-minute silence in which a resting state recording of EEG is made for scientific purposes, for which the audience are asked to focus their gaze on a point on the wall opposite them, while otherwise doing nothing in particular. After this, the 5 performers re-enter the space and the choreographic score itself begins. The score begins simply with a rhythmically repeated twisting action, and it evolves gradually from there, sustaining a continuity that is always developing and changing. The materials of the choreographic score engage the performers in a live practice of articulating momentum and perception at the same time. The atmosphere of the work has a rather hypnotic, contemplative quality, and the score journeys with what I at least like to think of as a seamless quality through a series of different spatial and qualitative states, finally building up to a more intensely and intensely pulsing rhythm in both the sound and the movement. After the choreographic score ends, everyone is asked to remain seated for another quiet 3-minute EEG resting state recording for scientific purposes. The work is proposing that, in their own ways, the performers, the audience members, the scientific, and the AI interpreter are all taking readings of what was never written. So maybe, Jamie, if we can just sort of describe a little bit the magic that you created. So when we first spoke at the beginning of this process, and I said, okay, now we've arrived at this point where I have this science fictional idea. And so I don't know how these things work. So then I said to you, how possible is it to make this a reality? Like, is this a plausible science fiction? And I wanted it to be plausible, even if it wasn't real. And then what I remember you saying is that it's entirely plausible, I can build all this for you, and basically it's just like a matter of time and resources, in a sense. So it'd be great if you could please say a little bit about what elements were actually happening.
So yeah, it's definitely plausible, and you can see examples of it, every day. In the supermarket, the camera tracking your movements to check that you're putting things through the scanner and into your bags. And, so these things are out there in the world, and one of the things that AI is very good at is kind of multimodal integration. So learning from different mediums. So text and image, obvious one. Text to sound, video. Movement is a less covered one, I think. So I think that's very interesting. But from the perspective of a machine learning or AI model, it's just another stream of data. So learning associations and patterns between just another data stream is perfectly plausible. So when we took this whole package and we thought, okay, well, what can we actually do within the time and resources we had available? I think the things that we prioritized were the spoken, so the AI being able to generate sentences, and then there was also AI processing the motion capture. And so I guess we should talk about the voice first, because you've talked about the tuning phase where performers are doing certain sequences of movement, and then they're vocalizing some meaning in words. There's an interesting question there about how do you translate between movement and words, but from an AI perspective, what it would just look for is correlations or associations between words that have been said and movement. So we wanted to personalize the AI. So it was, we looked at some various off-the-shelf kind of text-to-speech type AI models. Pretty much all of them sound very American. There's a few that you can tweak, but that makes sense because it's just they generate stuff based on what they've been trained on. So we wanted to try and take that concept but make it personal to the performers. So we set up a AI model that was trained on a huge corpus. We used only kind of open source, non-proprietary software to do this, and we took a pre-trained model that as our base model, and then we set up a recording session with the performers and text that had been developed by you guys during the process of making the piece, and we fine-tuned the AI model based on the performers' speech and their words. So this meant we could generate text, or spoken language in the voices of each of the performers. In the end, we decided to make a kind of hybrid. So the voice that you hear in the piece is kind of ambiguous in sort of gender and accent and just how it speaks. What else?
Motion capture.
Oh yeah, the motion capture. Okay, so we need to do this at some point. So we didn't do the whole shebang of training an AI on the motion capture live. That was a bit out of scope, but we did something that approximated that. So we had a depth camera at the end of the performance space, which was recording stereoscopic, so two lenses, so that we could infer depth just as our eyes do, and we were feeding that into a motion capture model that detects people. So we were able to get skeletal positions from each of the performers in the space and how they are moving in three-dimensional space. And so that was live. That was an AI model processing video in a live performance and extracting coordinates in three-dimensional space of where people are, where the performers were in the space. And from all of those different skeletal points, we turned those into a box for simplicity. So if somebody was close to the camera, they were a box in a certain point in the space. If they were back here, they were a box in a certain point of the space. And that was just a simple way to have a handle on the kind of movement that was being done. So it was a very coarse way of summarizing all of the information that was in the space, but we could get an idea about, were people standing tall, were they spreading wide? So we had these bunch of parameters available, and then those data streams were being sent to the AI speech system, and it was affecting the way that the AI spoke. So this actually happened it was only in the last section that we did this for real. But the movement of people in the space, so we were doing things like X, Y, Z, but also acceleration, how quickly were people moving, what was the average amount of movement in the space, the direction people moved, and all of that was being combined together to bias the way that the AI was speaking back in the space. So it was quite subtle, which I think kind of what we wanted. But there was definitely moments where, if there was a sudden synchrony between the dancers of all moving in a certain way, that might affect the pitch of the AI speaking back. And I think that's quite interesting that we managed to do that in real time, so that it was very, I would imagine that it would be perceptible to an audience that there is something going on here, there is some connection between the performance and then the words that are being spoken.
Maybe, maybe I just want to fill in slightly earlier in the work, the way that the AI voice works during the choreographic score is that we generated lots of language during the creative process, and we built up a library of words and phrases. And then what I did is I composed those into kind of sets or chapters, and then I attached those to different events in the choreographic score. So there'd be a certain set of words that could come up in the first 10 minutes, say. And then what Mirko and Jamie built was a software system that sort of semi-randomized the sequence in which those words are heard and the intervals between them. So I was able to artistically compose, it would be in the region of this, but still each time it was different. And then I think what would be great is to hear a bit from Guido about like the overall kind of scientific experimental design in this work as this kind of introduction to the context of Robin's work.
Sure. So, yeah, I've already talked about the idea of replication. So can we find similar patterns in our data for two very different works? Another layer of interest was this layering of information that is available to the audience. So Matthias already talked about the two baseline recordings at the start, so which sort of give us a sort of baseline synchrony among the audience that is simply related to being with other people in the same room without the performance happening. And against that, then we contrast the movements, so once the performance has started, but also the music, which, as Matthias already said, was also the first time we worked with live music that changed between every performance. And then on top of that, the voice. The voice for us came in particularly from, engagement with all works before that, really, this notion of ambiguity. So what does it do if we provide audiences with some kind of interpretation of what's going on? So whether that's realistic or not, is that something that, in what way does this influence brain synchrony between people if you have a verbal label that gets attached to the things that you're experiencing? So it's worth saying on that in order to do that properly, you need moments of silence and you need moments of words, but then you ideally also need moments of where there are sort of spoken sounds that aren't words. So the AI also produced sort of vocalizations that didn't amount to words. We're pretty early in the analysis of the data, so because that only happened in November, so we won't have any EEG data yet, but Robin has looked at the questionnaire data, and we also, for the first time, recorded heart rate synchrony from audiences, and that's what Robin will talk about.
Hello everyone, I'm Robin. I'm a second-year PhD student working with the NEUROLIVE project on Performance 4, and my main research looks at how do social contexts influence audience engagement at those collective experiences via the means of heart rate synchrony. And now the team has already explained the artistic side of what happened in Performance 4, but on the experimental side, what Performance 4 meant for me is that it's a stimuli, it's a contemporary dancing performance that spans 3 nights, and the participants were set in 2 rows facing each other and facing the performance. And then before the performance starts, we put about 55-56 fingertip heart rate sensor onto the participants who agreed to have their heart rate taken. And then we analyze their heart rate after the performance ends. So when I talk about heart rate, it's not just look at the raw heart rate, the raw changes of heart rate. Is it going higher? Is it going lower? We're doing another layer onto the heart rate itself, because it's hard to interpret something meaningful out of the raw heart rate, because we cannot say that, well, if I have a lower heart rate, it's a more engaging experience compared to a higher heart rate. But what we do know is that the changes in heart rate maps onto a change in your emotional experience. And if everyone in that room have a similar change of their heart rate, have a similar change of your emotional experience, then it must mean at that moment, at a particular moment of that performance, everyone is having a very similar experience, or that experience is delivering a message that captured everyone's attention. And to capture this uniform experience, we use this measure called heart rate synchrony, which captures the similarity of heart rate changes throughout the whole time course of the experience. And our lab have been using this measure in the past few years to calculate audience engagement in cinemas and theaters, and use that to predict audience engagement in ads, and also we try to use that to predict the results of Eurovision. And we also found some correlation between self-reported engagement and physiological synchrony, heart rate synchrony. And in one recent paper of our lab, we also made the argument that because heart rate is such a holistic measure that can be influenced by so many things around you in the environment, it is uniquely suitable to measure audience engagement, to measure your experience in the theaters, in those collective experiences, compared to use that in the lab when you can only have a visual stimuli to respond to. Now, what have we got from the heart rate synchrony then? In here, I plotted the trajectory of heart rate synchrony, which is our measure of audience engagement throughout the 3 days and throughout the performance. And on the y-axis is the height of heart rate synchrony. And what we see from here is that although they do have a slightly different pattern of changing heart rate synchrony, they do have their similar peaks and troughs at particular times, and day one seem to be slightly different in a way, which we'll get into at a later stage. And when we have those time course trajectories, I started to ask ourselves, what happens at those peak heart rate synchrony moments? Now this is the first common heart rate peak, heart rate synchrony moment. That this is a moment where the performers will dance in close proximity with each other, therefore all the audience members start to look at the same area. And at this moment, the background music started to have more layers, especially there is a rhythmic drum-like layer. And also, at this moment, is the AI voiceover that appeared during the performances for the first time. And this is the second common peak, I think. It's when the performers lined up and they were swaying back and forth with rhythmic music. And this is the final common peak. This is when the performers started to slowing down from their fast-paced choreography, and there is rhythmic tapping and clapping at the background music. And this is also when the AI voiceover made its last appearance. But also, this is towards the end of the whole performance. It's just like when you are watching a movie, you are towards the end, you started to ask yourself, you started to ponder, what does it mean? What have I just witnessed? This collective pondering for meaning might have driven this heart rate synchrony up towards the end. Now we wanted to know what exactly synchronizes or what exactly synchronizes our heart rate. On a grounded level, we know that a shared, common, uniform experience synchronizes our heart rate. But we also know that those can come from rhythmic music. A lot of the research in the past few years have been using heart rate synchrony in classical music concerts and live concerts. And we also know that synchronized movements from performers can synchronize the heart rate and even brain activity. But this time, we perhaps can see that the AI narrative at the background can also synchronize our heart rate. But with heart rate synchrony, we can also see a lot more than that. We can compare if the audience engagement are different for the 3 days of the performance. And as you have already seen from the time course earlier, that day one was consistently at a lower level of heart rate synchrony, and our statistic test shows that it is indeed the case that in day one, the pairs that were watching the performance in day one had significantly lower heart rate synchrony compared to the pairs that watched the performance in day two, or the pairs watched the performance in day 3. We explained that in a way that we think because it's day 1 is our first day running, we are all trying to figure out how to run this thing more effectively, how to make our fingertip sensors work better, and our anxious, our murmur, our whisper towards the back might have been picked up by the audience, and that have perhaps created a less uniform experience for the audience. But what we can also see from heart rate synchrony is co-presence. In here, what I plotted is the heart rate synchrony pairs that occurred in the same day of the performance and the pairs that watched the different days of the performance. And because day 1 seemed to be slightly different, so from here on I have already removed the data points from day 1. And what we found is that when you are watching the same day's performance, although it's sort of the same performance, you can have a much higher heart rate synchrony when you are in the same day, in the same physical area, when watching this performance compared to when you are watching the same performance in a different day. And then I further asked, even if when we are indeed watching the same performance, are we actually watching the same performance? Now in here I plotted the distance of your seat against the heart rate synchrony, basically how far apart are you set in the theater. And what this plot shows is that we found a small negative correlation with seat distance with heart rate synchrony, which sort of suggests the farther apart you are set, the less similar experience this whole experience has given you. But what I've also plotted on top is a histogram which shows the number of data points we have for each level of seat distance. And you can see towards the end of the scale that we have smaller and smaller number of data points. This is because the layout of our theater makes that we don't have a lot of pairs that are set 29 seats apart compared to the pairs that are one seat apart. So I asked, maybe this relationship is not that linear. So I plotted another correlation plot with a more liberal fitting function. And here, what we see is that when you are between perhaps 1 seat apart to around 15 seats apart, your heart rate synchrony do not change too much. But there comes a drop-off point immediately after around 16 seats apart. What's unique about this 16, 15 seats apart is that if we record the layout of that theater on those performance nights, they are in 2 rows, and each row had 30 seats. And 15, 16 seats is exactly the halfway point of that row. So it perhaps shows us is that when you are set about halfway of the row apart, you started to get a dramatically different experience. But of course, this is quite an exploratory result, and I think if we are in a much, much larger theater, this sort of effect will be more profound. And then I asked myself another sort of fun question. Do I really need to snatch the best middle seats in the theater to get the best experience in that experience? Now, what I calculated here is the heart rate synchrony for pairs that were set in the middle of the row, and the heart rate synchrony for the pairs that sit towards the end of the row. And we do not find very significant differences. We do not find any significant differences between the heart rate synchrony, which sort of suggests, at least in our performance, which is a small intimate theater setup, that no matter how far away you set, no matter where you set in the rows, you still can get a very similar engaging experience. And because everyone is just so close to the performance. And lastly, I also did something similar to what Hani reported. I did a fact analysis which sort of explores the questionnaire measures and their relationship with each other and towards a latent factor. And we found 2 similar factors that Hani found in in the detective work, and we found a lot of those factors load onto a factor called engagement, and one factor loads heavily onto the factor called confusion. But what's unique about this performance is we have AI's involvement, and the AI involvement is making its appearance in those two questions where the participants were rating how much they were distracted by AI, how much they were confused by AI, and how much their knowledge of the performance were rated by them. And we call that factor as AI voice. What's also interesting to me is that there are a series of other items. There is connection to items that's relevant to the connection, to the performance, and to the others in the center. And there is my heart rate synchrony measure, which also sort of underscores your connection with others. And they all load very heavily onto the third factor. In here, we call it connection. And this is basically everything I've got so far. And if you have any further questions, feel free to.
Any thoughts?
Thanks. This particular set of results is very new to me, so I've sort of, I'm seeing it almost as freshly as you are. It brings up a few things, maybe sort of general thought that comes up, I guess, a lot in this interdisciplinary context is sort of, what happens when the artist is kind of confronted with the sort of results of the data. But for me, one thing it makes me think about is, I guess, Robin, the way you were speaking about whether people are sort of watching the same performance or not. And my interest is definitely in thinking in terms of, well, both the collectivity in the shared environment of the performance, but also really like a plurality and a space for difference in experience and perspectives and different lenses that people are bringing, different experiences that they're having through the lens of their own experiences in that moment, but also through the different lenses of their own life experiences. So something about that as a general thing. And then also when the interpretations come up from the data, that like in this particular context, I think our audience was just over 50 per show, as many people as we could fit into this particular room in that particular configuration. And then roughly half of those audience members were participants in the wearing the wearable sensors, including EEG, including other sensors that we'll get into. So a similar distribution to in detective work. And then the heart rate emotibit sensors, those were like a smaller subset of that, right? Did you say like 15? But for one show, it's like, right? Okay, yeah. So sort of like 18. The heart rate is recorded from 18 audience members out of like 50 in a show, and so I guess partly I'm thinking also about that being a sample, and I feel like that sampling in that context also remains important. When this in this particular design, when it's not a recording of the heart rate of every audience member in the room. But yeah, I'd love to hear questions and reflections from people too.
Thoughts, questions, comments to either Matthias or Robin? I think we're all ready for, there's one. Yeah.
Technical question was actually why you used like this fingertip method. Why not, for example, do like a patch to a heart or something like that? Just curious about this choice.
Well, it's mainly because it's just the gadget we have in our lab. And I personally would still favor those fingertip sensors compared to those vest sensors, because those vest sensors, for one, takes longer time for you to fit them on to the participant. It takes more effort, but fingertip sensor, it's sort of effortless. You can just put it on like your smartwatches every day, and it have like a smaller distraction from the participant from the actual experience itself, and I think it's a better way of measuring audience engagement in those live experiences.
Okay.
Yeah, this is a bit unformed, but I was just thinking, like, even when you were sort of describing, like, the dancers are coming together and there's a beat going, I felt kind of excited just hearing about it, and it just made me think about what we, and this relates a bit to what you were saying, like what we come to a performance with. Like, we might think, oh, I love Matthias's work, or, you know, there's a particular performer that we're sort of bringing. I guess I'm wondering, is there any research around that, or like the marketing, or how that sort of affects your engagement? I don't know. Do you understand what I'm saying? Yeah. Has that been part of any of the experiments at all?
Guido, you might have to sort of add to this, but so I would say that, yeah, interestingly, the whole thing about having the AI voice came partly from talking in a sort of conceptual, zoomed out way from the beginning of the project about framing effects and the effects of different framings on people's experiences of live performance, which I think includes what you just said. But then what we decided to do was, in this particular work, was to focus on these sort of like framing effects of verbal interpretations during the performance, as opposed to sort of approach or the lead up to the performance. But then also I think some of the things that you mentioned about, in a way, like how well you know the performers, how much dance experience you have potentially with that particular choreographer's work, some of those things are part of the questionnaires. So in that sense, some of that information, to some extent, gets has some sort of recognition in the data collection.
Just very briefly, that's part of also, so Matthias also referred to dance experience. So in a way you can think of prior dance experience as a framing effect. So the more you know, you come in with a different frame. You know more about contemporary, you know more, maybe people have seen your work or Matthias's before, and that's all. So in some ways it's incorporated. But the other, so in one way it's very difficult to get around that, sort of when you work in a real world context, unless you sort of invite people, okay, there's going to be a show happen, you don't know by whom it is, sort of then you can get around that, so we will show randomly Matthias or Seke on different nights, for example. That might be one way of dealing with it, but people don't know what they're signing up for. That's difficult to do for various reasons. But you can also, it's also the reason why this idea of replication is so important, because, sort of this idea of people will come in with different expectations to different shows, but the fact that we find, engagement and confusion with both suggests that that's a relevant concept or a relevant way of experiencing the work that at least transfers to two very different works. I think it's also worth saying that what engagement means in this sort of data-driven way that we use is slightly different for all works, sort of like it contains slightly different questions every time, and like they're weighted in different ways. And that's, I guess, why we call it engagement, because it's not just I like it or I don't like it, or I'm moved by it, or it makes me curious. It's all of these different elements together, but with different weightings for different works. But they coalesce on, I think, or we think, into this bigger thing about I want to keep watching. there was one final question, and then we should definitely go into lunch.
Yeah, I was interested in when enough's enough. With the heightened peaks, how long you can extend that for before people they need to break off from that, the loud beat or the stare, and you might lose them if you don't get that right. Or different audiences, diverse people, that might be a very different experience.
Yeah, I think you of course cannot maintain their attention, their engagement for indefinite period of time. And what's actually quite sad these days is that people's attention span are shortened because all those short movies are coming in, short videos, TikTok, and people start to watch those much, much shorter stimuli, and they started to be adapted even in a bad way to those shorter stimuli, and it's harder these days to maintain their engagement for a longer period of time. But traditionally, it's also why your lectures are around 45 minutes to 1 hour long, because that's the most optimal length of engagement that you can sustain the attention to.
Yeah, and perhaps I guess your question also goes to this idea of concentrating and dispersing attention. So I think of this process over time not as something like, okay, except maybe in sort of West End musical theatre where you start and then it just stays at a level like there for like an hour, but I think I think of it more in the way that we phrased it to Seke. So what's choreographed is both the sort of concentration of attention, but also the dispersing. So, sort of the moments where you relax and where you sort of things are built in, and they're also directed, just as the moments of sort of more synchronizations are.